Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome you back to our G80. Today, we're going to be doing some more track-oriented preparation, and we're installing EBC rotors and pads. And these things are pretty nice. They've got a lot of really good features that'll benefit significantly on the track. And the pads are going to help provide some really needed stopping power under heavy load. These brakes are more than capable as far as the actual calipers go, but we're going to go ahead and upgrade the components that could use some love. We've got everything set up over here, and to give you an idea of what we're doing, these EBC Racing rotors are two-piece floating rotors. They've got spring clips on them and locking nuts, so everything should be very good there, especially with high temps. A benefit of something like this is that it allows the rotor to move essentially. So as everything heats up and as you're braking and everything's vibrating, instead of the caliper taking up that vibration and load, which would normally happen, these will absorb a lot of that, which results in no fluctuation in pressure in the braking system and keeps everything much more consistent. The pads that we've got for the front are the RPX line. It's a track-only pad, and it's probably going to be pretty terrible cold, but we're going to go ahead and expect that they'll be excellent as soon as they get warmed up. And for the rear, we've got the Street and Track blue pads, which really, they should work really well. One thing that I am curious about, and we'll find out during testing, is the noise. I have a lot of experience with the yellow and red stuff. Red stuff seems to work okay, but it doesn't hold up too well to high temps. This will be much more resilient. The yellow stuff, though, has a tendency to be a little bit noisy. So I'd like to see how this is on our test drives after we get everything bedded in and see how they work. And then we can give you a good opinion of if it's a good street pad to use that you'd be able to enjoy on your daily, or if it's something that would be more track oriented. All right. Yeah, a lot of Loctite. Now with our bracket off, be able to get these pads out, and so let's see how these stack up with the EBC Racing kit. All right, so we'll start with the weigh-in. Let's go ahead and take a look at how much the OEM rotors weigh, which the front one is a massive hulk of metal. We've got 28 pounds even. And the rear, which is a featherweight comparatively, we've got 18.1. Now for the contenders. Our big front rotor. Now this is massive, so I expect it to be fairly heavy. But I do anticipate that this should be lighter. I could be wrong. I'm wrong. 28.8 pounds. And the front, or the rear, excuse me, we've got 19.8. So the weight difference, albeit more, is really negligible, especially when you take a look at some of the benefits that you get with this kit. So to highlight what I'm talking about, we'll start with the rears. Now, these are designed to be able to flex a little bit and really perform fairly well. However, when you have a two-piece rotor that's floating like this, these springs are able to absorb a lot of vibration that would normally get transmitted through the hydraulic system. Additionally, they help with heat expansion a lot, so there aren't going to be nearly as many negative effects from overheating and warping with a floating rotor. When we look at the vanes on the actual cooling fins here, you'll see that these are spread much further apart. They are directional, which is good, but they're not going to be super duper effective at moving air. When we look at these, we've got very sharp fins that are going to be grabbing the air. Additionally, they come much further out towards the edge of the rotor, which is going to yield a much larger benefit for cooling than hiding them within the rotor. Now, when it comes to the fronts, we've got the same thing going on. They are pegged and they do have directional cooling fins, but again, these ones are going to stand closer to the edge and are going to have a very sharp tooth, which is going to help in ejecting that air. This is going to be a fun kit to run, and we really expect that it's going to hold up to what we have been told. All right, so the next step of this adventure is going to be getting the OEM pads out of the front. To do that, we've got to remove these pins and the pads will go forward. Then we'll be able to get the new ones popped in there, and just keep in mind that this is a spring that holds these down against these pins. So there is going to be some tension, but it shouldn't be too much to overcome. Now these pins are just press fit in here. And it's good to use a little punch to help guide them out. That way you don't hit the rotor or the caliper. Now we should be loose enough to pull these away. There we go. And this one should be a little easier now. Brake dust likes to hold on to these guys. So now we can press the pads out towards the front. And with the way that these are designed, we've got to get the new pads in now, and then we'll be able to put it onto the rotor once everything is assembled. All right, so to give ourselves the best shot at these being fairly quiet during street use, we're going to use some ATS Plasti Lube on the pads and really anywhere that is going to be making contact and potentially vibrating. These don't have a liner like the OEM ones, which basically adds an insulative layer. So this will definitely give it a fighting chance. Don't go too crazy if you're using this stuff. You just want a thin layer. Naturally with lubricants, they thin out when they heat up. So you just want it to be thin enough where it will stay a thin layer on this external surface of the pad, not the friction surface, the surface that makes contact with the pistons. So these springs can hold quite a bit of tension. So just know that it can be a challenge, but be patient and you will overcome. All right, so we've got the pad in place. We'll get our pins started up top and work on getting our spring compressed on that side. And now we've got that pin started. We can move to the lower one, which is now in position. And we'll grab our other pad and do the same with it. Now, as you're handling these, try not to touch the lubricant that we just applied because you don't want it on your fingers and getting onto the friction surface. Our pad on the top is secured and our pad on the bottom is secured. Now, these pins on the back side have a spring lock. So they've got to be pressed all the way in to be fully secured. Again, we'll use our small plastic hammer to get those seated. And then I would recommend following up with a punch and just making sure that they're set all the way down. And with those locked in place, we can put the rotor on. Right, and in the event that yours aren't, no matter whether they're these rotors specifically or even the OEM ones, it's important that the direction of the cooling vanes are facing backwards. It would make one think that you want it to be scooping the air into it, but that's not how this is working. You want it to be ejecting the air out of it. So they've got to be facing the rear of the car, and as long as you get that set up, these will work wonderfully. But that was not the case. We've got to get the caliper mounted onto the new rotor. Now, these being fresh, they are as thick as it gets, and the pads being brand new, they're gonna take up all the space too. So we may need to do some compressing as we get it on there, but with any luck, we did a good enough job when we took it apart that it won't fight us. All right, so we'll go ahead and start lining things up by getting the top bolt placed, and this is actually going on super easily. So now, oftentimes with this style of caliper, these studs fit very tight. So you've got to rock it on a little bit and just try to keep it as straight as possible. Snug them down, and then as we get the rear completed, we will go over all of the bolts that we've loosened and reference the torque specs that are needed. All right, so we've got to get the caliper compressed now, and this may be a different style than what is in your standard compressor kit. We've got one that will work for us, but it'll work on a few different principles. So ideally, you would have a puck that has 3 pins in it that will fit in each one of these slots. But we've got a puck that is the right diameter to fit around the piston, and 1 pin, so it'll use the 1 slot to help us get the rotation. Now, these Euro calipers are different than a lot of your standard Puller calipers that you'd find on American cars, Japanese cars, where you don't just compress them, you have to compress them and spin them simultaneously. So we'll get the puck placed here and make sure that it's fitting around the piston. So we will get the pin on this puck oriented into one of the slots and make sure that the puck is sitting around the piston there. And then we have to line our 2 pins on this up with that. And ideally, we'll have a pretty simple experience with this. We don't have to go very far, as these are brand new brakes and the piston hasn't had a chance to travel very far out at all. So it should just be a couple turns and we'll have everything done. So I like to use an adjustable wrench here and put a little bit of tension on this, and you'll feel it compress a little bit and then stop. Once that happens, hold this and turn this guy. And what will happen is we're actually screwing the piston in. Now, it will stop again under a couple different circumstances. If it needs to go in more than it's turning, or if you've reached the bottom, which we just have. So we'll go ahead and get this loosened up, and we can go ahead and get our rotor put on. All right, so as with the front, these are specifically clocked utilizing 2 set screws. So make sure that it goes on the right way and it will sit flush to the hub. We'll get our set screws started here. Now we'll go ahead and move on to getting the new pads put in. Now, when getting these swapped over, you will want to take note of which pad is front and rear. Now, inside, outside, if you will. They are different, and you can clearly see that on these new pads. We've got a slot here that receives the pad wear sensor, and there's not one here. So this guy goes on the outside, this guy goes on the inside. Now, there's a couple different factors that are at play here too, as far as the pin placement on these pads. So there may be some interference issues if they're put in incorrectly. So just take note that they go in the correct way. Now we'll go ahead and get these pads popped out. And it can be easiest to do it inward, especially with these brackets here. And this should come right out. We may need to pop it down, but they should pop right out. We'll go ahead and get the sensor and these clips cleaned up, and then get these guys lubricated and put the new pads in. Everything cleaned up, we'll go ahead and get the clips put back in, but first we will go ahead and put a thin layer of our magic brake sauce on the surfaces where the pads will ride. And what that will do is help prevent any squealing from the pads vibrating on the surface. And again, you want to be very conservative with the amount that you use. It shouldn't be anything that once it heats up can drip off. It should just be a thin layer that will provide the lubrication and dampening that we want. So now that these are ready, we'll go ahead and get them placed, and they will go with the lip that continues across, facing outward. And they'll snap on to each side, and just make sure that they're sitting as flush as possible, because they do act as springs for the pads. You'll notice here we've got a locking clip. Just make sure that it slides over and doesn't get pressed under. So we'll go ahead and get the pad wear sensor popped in here, and it will slide in and lock in place. There's a little nub on here, and that nub you want to have facing where the rotor will be. Eventually over time, as these pads wear down, the rotor will start to hit that and wear it down to the metal, which will break the circuit and alert that the pads are wearing. Put these in, they'll rock in at an angle. Get the ears in here at a 45-degree angle or so, and start to twist and press down, and they will fall into their home. If you just look at the shape, you'd think that one goes, or that this is the other way, but yeah, cool. Okay, so everything is in place now. We can go ahead and get the caliper bracket installed over the rotor, and then get the caliper popped back on. So this bracket will go into place here, and you want to make sure to wrap the pads around the rotor and then gently guide it into place. And once we get it here, we'll get our bolts put into position and hand tight. And we'll get the lower one in. Okay, so pads are squeezed up against the rotor, brackets are installed, and we're ready to get the caliper set in place. Now, having already completed compressing the caliper, this should be as simple as sliding it over. We want to run the brake pad wear sensor through the caliper, and then we'll gently start to put it into place. Now, the same pins that we discussed in the beginning of the video that the caliper is bolted to, we are going to need to keep an eye on those, because they can be a little pesky and get in our way. The thing about these particular brakes is it would seem that the actual pad shims are acting as springs as well. Let's see. Okay, so problem solved. You've got to rock the caliper in with the bottom first. Otherwise, the motor for the e-brake hits the bottom stud. And that was easy. Now we can rerun this wear sensor line. And it goes up, down, up, down, up. And I'll reconnect it and put it back into its box. All right, so to finish everything up, we're gonna go ahead and torque everything down to specification. On the front, the nuts that retain the caliper will be torqued to 95 Newton meters. $95 and $95. All right, so the rear caliper carriers that bolt to the wheel carrier get torqued down to 110 Newton meters. All right, so that guy is torqued down. Okay, we are all finished up. We'll get the wheels on, and then it's out to bedding and testing.